Hi, welcome back to another TerranScapes video. This video is going to discuss a proper mixing procedure for a couple of urethane smooth-on products. I should say smooth-on urethane products, it's probably a better order. Particularly, I'm going to look at Ure-Fil 11, which is a ground fiber material to mix into urethane rubbers and other compounds to thicken them for brush-on application, let's say, or a variety of other reasons. And the reason I want to discuss this is that I had a moderate to minor major problem when I was making the molds for the island cliff pieces, which are part of the ocean board set. So if you go to the playlist for the ocean board set, which is the recent project I'm working on, you will see in some of the recent videos me talking about this. And really, this came down to me not reading all of the directions properly. So I'm going to go over those directions. I'm going to put a link to the description, to the directions in the description down below. And I'm going to try to show you how to mix it properly beyond the information that is provided in the mixing instructions, because I think a little more information above that is actually pretty helpful. So let's go over, take a look at this, and hopefully you'll learn something about mixing materials in general that will help you in a variety of ways when you're making your molds. So as I mentioned in a previous video where I was making the cliff mold for the ocean boards, I was using Reoflex. Now I started with Reoflex 20 and then I moved to Reoflex 40. These are a 1-to-1 part urethane rubber compound, which I was then tinting with urethane. Well, it is a urethane colorant made by Smooth-On. It's their So Strong tint, and I've selected green here for our demonstration purposes for today. But before we get to mixing these compounds, I just want to mention a little bit about Ure-Fil 11. I'm just going to slide this over for just a second. All right. Ure-Fil 11 is a fiber fiber additive, but if you notice, it's really got a very clumpy texture. Now the nice thing about that is it doesn't tend to get airborne very easily, so it's not much of a breathing hazard, which is nice because some kinds of fillers actually can be substantial breathing hazard. But it's light in weight and tends to form clumps like that. All right, so that's Ure-Fil 11. Ure-Fil 11 is designed for thickening urethane rubbers and has other applications as well, which you can find on the Smooth-On website. And of course, there'll be directions to how to use this in the description, as I mentioned before. However, before I show you mixing it into the Reoflex, I wanted to do a sample mixing and to show you what I was doing and why it doesn't work. So in this instance, what I've done is I've selected just some water that I have tinted with some ink, right? So we got some red and we have some blue. And what I have done is, what I started doing, I should say, was mixing it into one of the parts, mixing it evenly, and then combining the two. Now, that worked all right when I was doing small amounts, but I'm going to show you the biggest problem that happens right away when you try to mix a large amount of Ure-Fil into a large amount of the material. All right, so let's just, I'm going to exaggerate it here for purposes of instruction. So once you start to mix it in, all right, now this is going to be dependent on the viscosity of the liquid. Obviously, water has a very, very low viscosity. When you look at, and I've mentioned this in a previous video where I've talked about the properties of casting and mold making materials, they rate the viscosity of materials as a CPS, and the CPS of Reoflex is, say, I think it's around 1200 if memory serves me, maybe 1500. Water has a CPS of 1. Now, in the most extreme example, which actually this is about as extreme as you can get, you can see how difficult it is for me to get this material into this liquid. It's because it is hydrophobic, right? So it's not allowing the water to penetrate the small particle, surfaces And, oh, we're not even going to get to see exactly. Wow, that is, all right. I'll be fair. I did not test this beforehand. Having had some mixing issues, I just added a little bit of rubbing alcohol to give it a, to basically wet the water, right? It's a surfactant. It breaks down tension in the surface of the water, so I can mix this in a little bit easier. So if you notice, see here in the water, right, we have particles that are mixed, but they're still clumps. That is what I was seeing when I was initially mixing it into large volumes of the, whatever the mold making material was, Reoflex in this instance. I'm going to try and just keep this away from this. That's actually poor practice. Ure-Fil, in like any other urethane compounds, hates moisture, causes big problems really, really fast. All right, so I'm not going to be able to get this even mixed in. I was able to get it mixed into the Reoflex because it has a higher viscosity, and so I could smash it. What I was doing is smashing it against the sides so that I could mix it in. But man, that is really, really, let's just for purposes of experiment, right? I'm going to add some rubbing alcohol to this to break that surface area down just a little bit more, because it doesn't need to be perfect in this setup. I just want to show you the basic concept. All right, so we have something that's, now it's easy to, here's a great view though of why you add surfactants to materials that you're mixing, right? Or spraying, right? Notice how that breaks down those clumps a lot easier. But, right, we still have all of those clumps. This is not evenly distributed. And when I would combine them, all right, so we'll do it like this. Notice, right, we still have clumps in there. And you can see obviously here that this is not mixing any better. All right, so it was really hard to get these out the way I was originally doing it, and I was adding it to one part and then mixing it in the second part. And if you look, you can still see, right, some of these clumps actually still look pink. They've got bits of part A still in it, undissolved, and that is not what you want when you're mixing these compounds. And if you have enough of these parts floating around, and some of these smaller ones that don't look pink are pink, then you're not going to have the proper reaction because the two components aren't mixing, well enough to be able to set up the chemical reaction. And this is why I got poor results. So, take these away. So let's take a look at how I think it's best to be done using the actual material, Reoflex 40, and the tint. Now, the first thing that the directions say is to mix both of them before adding the Ure-Fill. All right, so I'm going to add, now these two parts are not exactly measured evenly because I don't really need to have them measured evenly for this video, but usually I measure them based on predetermined marks on the cups. However you want to measure them is up to you. Read the directions on Reoflex 40 for proper measuring techniques. It's not the purpose of this video. So I am going to just scoop out the bulk of it. All right, and you can see, well, wait a minute, let me mix it. When they talk about its CPS value, right, it is its viscosity. It is from, actually, I wish I could get my, there we go, so you can see it against the side of the cup. Right, they're talking about after it's been mixed. So I'm going to give this a good mix, and you know what? Let's speed this up. Okay, so hopefully you noticed a couple things I was doing. One is to scrape the bottom of the cup very, very frequently. It'd technically be better if I was using a stick with a flat bottom, but in my experience, if I'm careful enough, I've been successful in mixing it well. The other thing is to scrape off the stick from time to time, get that material out, mix it back into the material so you don't have uncured sections, along your stir stick, along the sides of your cup, that kind of an idea. This is more and more important as the materials get thicker and thicker and thicker. So when you're doing like rubbers where they have a very high viscosity, it's even more important to do that. But similar principle with Envirotex Light, for instance, which is a urethane resin. You really want to scrape down. Now here's to show you the difference in the consistency. All right, that's a CPS of, I really think it's 1500. I'm really positive. Oh, maybe 1800 actually. You can check. Smooth On has a list of it on their site. All right, now the instructions for the Ure-Fill are to double mix it to ensure you get all the way mixed, mixing completely. Now, what I have done is I've put in all of the Ure-Fill that I want. Let's move this out of the way for a quick second. All right, so I'm going to put in quite a bit here. We're going to make a brush-on mold, and I want this to be a mixture that doesn't sag when I apply it, and I also want it to be thick enough that I can fill in undercuts, all right, so they don't slump, and so I can get in those big voids. So I'm going to actually go with about a little over 50-50 by volume, okay? Now this is just me eyeballing it, and a little practice will give you the proper amounts for your particular application. But that's just the way I'm going to do it. So what I was doing is adding my Kick-It and my tint to the Ure-Fill rather than adding it to this. And my thinking was that if I get my tint mixed evenly, that also will help me indicate that I've mixed the Ure-Fill evenly. And in order to do that, you can't, well, you can, but you're not going to like it. You can't just dump this all in because there's so much liquid, it's very hard to drive out all of those little clumps. So what you do, what I do, and what I strongly recommend is to add a small amount of your pre-mixed rubber and then mix that in. What you're going to do is you're going to end up creating a paste. And if you don't have enough material to make the paste, add a little more. Better to add too little than too much. And by doing this, right, I can push it along the sides of the cup and mash all of that filler. I'm going to add a little bit more. And mash all of that filler into a smooth paste. This is not dissimilar from many things that you might do when you're cooking, say when you're going to use wheat flour to make a gravy, right? You don't just dump all the wheat flour into the gravy, otherwise you get lumpy gravy. Okay, so you add a little bit, then you mix that in until it's a paste, then you add a little bit more, then you add a little bit more. You can see now the color is starting to get more uniform. You don't see big clumps, but if I move it, see in the bottom there, we are still getting a little bit of dry area. Tint's a little stronger. Make sure you work the corners. And while I do this, I want to point out two things that are important in this process. So let's just keep going while I chat. Number one, each material has its own pot life. Pot life is the usable amount of time you have in order to get your material out of the cup and onto the project you're working on. For Reoflex 40, that pot life, if I recall correctly, and I believe I do, is 20 minutes. Now that sounds like a lot of time, but don't forget, I've already taken the time to mix this, make sure it's properly mixed. Now I have to go back through and mix it again. And this is what I'm considering the double mix, where I've done one mix and then I'm mixing the Ure-Fill in a second cup. And if you add anything to this, like Kick-It, for instance, which is what I was doing, you've shortened the pot life even more. Pot life in that case would go down to about 8 minutes, depending on the amount of kick it that you add. Now, let's see here. You can see, right, at this point, that I am now getting a very uniform mixture with no clumps. I see a little bit of a color clump of dark green down there, but for the most part, right, the color is uniform. The Ure-Fill looks uniformly added. Let's scrape this side down. Let's add the rest of this. Let's do this. All right, now if I had added all of this at once, there would be clumps in this material that would be very, very hard to get out. Can you work with a couple clumps in it? Is it going to ruin the entire batch of rubber? No, but there will cause, each clump will cause a small area in the mold that will just be structurally not sound. You're not going to have rubber bonding properly at those points, and so you may be more prone to tears or that sort of an idea when you go to use the mold. So I really think this is the best way to ensure that you avoid any of the Ure-Fill ending up clumping in the actual mix itself. And again, I like adding the green tint to it, or whatever tint, to the Ure-Fill container, so that I know I've got that mixed evenly, and that's sort of a guide for me for the Ure-Fill as well. Now, let's just finish up that discussion on pot life real quick. So, the pot life means that the material is too thick to really work with. When you add a heavy amount of filler, all right, to your mixture, you are in essence shortening its pot life. If this gets stiffer than you can spread, right, you already can't use it, and part of the point of mixing it is to make it thicker. So you're kind of compressing the pot life slightly. You add kick it to it, and you're compressing the pot life even more. And in the end, you might be looking at, instead of having a 20-minute pot time, you may be looking at a 5-minute pot time, depending on how much Ure-Fill you add to it. So when you're doing a heavy amount of filling for undercuts, and in fact, I should really add, you know what? Just for our experimental purposes, let's just add a little bit more. Let's say that's not thick enough in my mind. All right? This is not a bad idea. And we'll wrap this up. All right? So that wasn't thick enough. Notice now I'm taking more time because I have to mix this in, and that is going to make your pot lifetime, right, more and more compromised. So think about that when you're working on these things. How much time do you have? Get your materials ready. Think about how they're going to affect the total pot life, because there were a few moments when I was working with these where all of a sudden I was thinking, oh boy, it's getting a little tight for me to be able to get this onto the mold where I want to. All right. So let's do that. That's fairly well mixed, and let's take a look at it and see. Now, I don't know if you'll see that on camera, but I can see some, not many, but some small clumps, and by small I mean very tiny clumps of Ure-Fill not mixed in. I don't think that's going to compromise this mixture because they're so tiny, and you'll notice it went in mixed in easier because the material is so thick. It's got such a high viscosity that it's able to shear those clumps apart, and the clumps, can't slop around in there on their own, right? They get stuck, and then you shear them when you mix it. So the higher the viscosity of the material you have, the easier it's going to be to mix it in. And when you're doing a low viscosity material, you're really going to want to add just a little bit, blend that into a paste, add a little more, blend that into a paste until you get all of the Ure-Fill mixed in quite well. 1800 for Reoflex 40 is a very thin viscosity for urethane rubber. It's self-degassing, and so it's a good example of why you need to pour in small amounts at a time. Otherwise, you end up with something that's going to be closer to this, and again, you can still see how some of this is not mixed in properly. So that is a tip and a guide to how to mix filler, Ure-Fill, Ure-Fill 11 into Reoflex 40, but really it's a general guideline to all kinds of filler mixing and the importance of understanding the viscosity, the material, and reading the directions. So that gives you a look at least what I've learned and the process I'm using to mix Ure-Fill into Reoflex rubbers. And really, if I could stress anything to you, it's that read the directions. And that's because that's what I keep stressing to myself. You know, I've done a lot of mold making. I've done a lot of types of additives and, you know, thickeners and tints and all sorts of stuff over the years. And it's all too easy to get overconfident and to say, oh, I don't need to read the directions for this. That's simple. Because each, you know, component that you add has its own nuances, right? Some you're supposed to mix to part A before you mix them both. Some you mix after you've mixed them both. Some, you know, you want to check, and you want to check all of the components, you know, including the filler. So, as I said, there's a link in the description down below if you're curious to see what the actual instructions are for the filler as per Smooth-On. Also, I wanted to mention, I saw a similar mixing video from Brick in the Yard, and Brick in the Yard's video, I'll put a link in the description as well to this. It is for their 7420 brush-on mold. And they show mixing a very similar compound into their mold rubber, and they do it actually different than the way I just showed you. So, you know, it's kind of nice to maybe see an alternative and also to recognize that probably what I'm showing you is not the be-all, end-all. And if it's wrong, and Smooth-On watches this or somebody else, tell me, but it's working. In any case, you know, don't be afraid to take a look at what other people are doing as well and see, you know, see what the best method for you is that can prevent you from ending up with half of your very complicated mold suddenly not curing. Not good, not good. So hopefully you found this helpful. I know going through this process was helpful for me. So please feel free, always, I say it and I do mean it. Leave questions and comments down below. Always appreciate it. You know, I do my best to try to answer all of your questions, and it may take me, you know, a few days to get to them. I'm sort of hit or miss on timing for answering comments, so sometimes I just blast through them all in one big burst. And so if you have to wait 5 days or so to hear from me, don't think I've ignored you. I will get to your comment because I do read every single one of them. So until then, I'll just say I'll see you soon in another TerranScapes video.